Hello, my name's Paul Robinson. I'm a writer of books on thyroid treatment and I'm a thyroid patient advocate, which means I work online a little bit with patients and I also do private consults with people that really need help. I've been doing this work for well over 10 years now. I'll say a little bit about my books before I come to today's topic. The books really form a series of books now on hypothyroidism and how to recover from it. The last book I wrote is called The Thyroid Patient's Manual. It's coming out very well in that light. There we are, The Thyroid Patient's Manual. And it really is, even though it's the last book that I wrote, it probably could be viewed as the first book of the series, the Recovering from Hypothyroidism series. It's a manual. It's trying to be very broad. It's dealing with how to recover from hypothyroidism, how to diagnose it in the first place, and how to recover from it. It deals with all the treatments, T4, natural desiccated thyroid, T4, T3, and T3 monotherapy. It also covers a whole bunch of other issues that are critical to look at as someone tries to get better, issues like low iron, low cortisol, and a whole bunch of other things. It's written as simply as I could possibly write it for people that think they might have a thyroid problem, or maybe have been on medication for a while and it's just not working. And I think it's a great book. And it effectively is the first book in the series, even though it's the last one that I wrote. The first one that I wrote could be viewed as the second book in the series. It's called Recovering with T3. It's probably the book that I'm most well known for, and really it is about using T3 monotherapy or T3 mostly therapy to recover from hypothyroidism when other treatments do not work well, and sometimes they don't work well, and I will talk about that as we go through this talk today. Recover with T3 remains the best protocol for using T3. It explains everything about T3 and how it can be used safely and effectively to get well. And safety is really important. It also includes an optional part of the protocol called the circadian T3 method, or CT3M. And that I created that many years ago in order to recover from very low cortisol. And it worked well and I still use it. And I know many hundreds, probably thousands of people use it also when they have low cortisol. Probably the last book in the series, although it's the second one I wrote, it's called the Tsh T3 Handbook. This one basically answers more questions about using the circadian T3 method for those people that absolutely need to use it to get their cortisol levels corrected. So those are the books. Again, they form effectively a complete series for recovering from hypothyroidism. And for anybody that hasn't read any of the books, I would start with the Thyroid Patient's Manual because it's a great place to start. So, what's the topic of today's talk? It's not just about me telling you about my books and what I do. It is, I'll put this diagram out here. Let's see if I can get this to work properly. It is about this system. Let's hold it a bit closer for you. This is a diagram straight out of the Thyroid Patient's Manual. It's called our energy system. It includes a hypothalamus and pituitary. It includes the thyroid gland and the adrenals and our cells and all the hormonal connections between them. Okay, that's what I'm going to talk about, the whole system. And the reason it's important to talk about the whole system is that they do operate within a system together. And to deal with one in isolation, think you can do that without understanding how it all works, leads to many problems, and many doctors and many endocrinologists attempt to do this and get it all wrong. That's why lots of people do not get well on thyroid treatment. That's what I'm going to talk about. I will come back to that. Okay, let's move this camera up again. Okay, there we are. So I have some notes, which I'm going to have to use. I'll put my specs on. Okay, so we're going to talk about the energy system. Why? Why do I want to talk about that? And the reason I want to talk about that is that many doctors, I would say most doctors, probably many endocrinologists, maybe most endocrinologists, they have certain views. And here's some of the key ones that I hear a lot from thyroid patients. T4 always works and it always converts to T3 correctly, sufficiently. T4 is the hormone replacement and it always works. That's one thing that they believe. Many of them, most of them I would say. TSH always tells us exactly whether your hormone levels are correctly treated. Okay, so they're really reliant on TSH. I'll come back to these comments in a minute. Thyroid labs are enough to check your entire hormone status. You know, you can talk to me if I'm pretending to be a doctor now, right? You can talk to me about your symptoms and the energy level and all of that, but to be honest, your thyroid labs are a complete description of how you feel in terms of thyroid hormones. And what do we think about those comments? Now, they're all wrong, or they're very, very crudely applied. They're not correct at all. That's what I think about them. So what's important to be aware of is that when you're well and healthy prior to any thyroid problems, you have a healthy thyroid gland. Being healthy with a working thyroid gland is not the same as being on thyroid treatment. It changes everything, and a lot of the philosophy that's been applied today in terms of thyroid management, thyroid treatment, is based on data from healthy people, not based on data from people with thyroid issues who are under treatment. Right, next set of notes. Okay, so this is where I need to get into more detail. I will come back to the energy system shortly. What they don't understand, doctors and endocrinologists, at least most of them, conversion rate is affected by many things. It is not constant. Conversion rate from a T4 hormone that you take when you take Synthroid or levothyroxine, that T4 hormone, that doesn't always convert to T3. And why does it need to convert to T3? I've said this so many times in other videos. T3 is the biologically active thyroid hormone. It is the only hormone that actually does anything in your cells of any shape, way, shape or size. It is the active hormone. If you don't have enough T3, then you don't have biologically active thyroid hormone. So it has to convert well. Doctors believe that T4 always converts, and it doesn't. What affects that? What can change conversion rate? Okay, well, the thyroid tissue itself is really, really, really important. Basically, the thyroid gland is the biggest converter of T4 to T3 in the body. It's more important than the liver, more important than the kidneys, more important than all the muscles and everything. It's the biggest converter. Together with the small amount of T3 it makes in a healthy thyroid gland, it accounts for about 25%, a whole quarter of your T3 in your body when you're healthy, when your gland's healthy. But if you have Hashimoto's thyroiditis and the tissue starts to get destroyed, you start to have less thyroid gland, or you have a partial or a full thyroidectomy, and basically you lose that conversion machine. It goes away, it doesn't exist anymore, and you lose that T3. And taking more levothyroxine doesn't fix that. And even when you take natural desiccated thyroid, you still have a huge T4 content there, and it's not converting as well as it used to. So that's a big factor. We also know now that gene defects are a big factor, and they're discovering more gene defects all the time. We know the genes that are responsible for allowing the enzymes, the D1 and D2 deiodenase enzymes that are critical to converting T4 to T3. we know that those genes can be damaged. We know about DIO1 and DIO2 gene defects. If you don't, you can go to my website, recoveringwitht3.com. You can look at the blog. On the blog list, I've got a blog on DIO1 and DIO2 gene defects. For someone who has gene defects, they may not convert as well from T4 to T3. I have both gene defects and I have both copies. My mum and dad were really kind to me and gave me a copy of each of those. So I'm a very, very bad converter of T4 to T3. So that's a problem. But they're also finding gene defects for the receptors, thyroid receptors, and other things. And they'll continue to understand this. And it's going to be a big field and very important field of research over years to come. So those are important. Other things can also affect conversion. I haven't got the time to go through all of this, but for instance, B12, low B12 can affect conversion rate from T4 to T3. So conversion rate can be effective. It is not constant. It is not guaranteed you're going to get enough T3 from the T4 that you take in whatever medication that you take. Conversion varies. Doctors don't understand that. Most of them don't understand that. Okay, let me talk about another point here. Thyroid gland. In a healthy person, the thyroid gland is a critical part of the control system and the way everything works. It's not just a little machine that makes T4 and T3. It has a heavy influence on how the whole system works. I've mentioned already it's the biggest converter of T4 to T3. But it also, because it converts an awful lot of T4 to T3 and it releases it smoothly throughout the day, and it releases a lot of it, it manages to do that in a way, in a healthy person, in a way that doesn't overly suppress TSH. Now, you probably are aware that TSH from the pituitary is governed by the amount of T4 and T3 in the bloodstream that the pituitary gland sees. The thyroid manages to do its work without overly affecting TSH, because when you get high T4 and high T3, the pituitary produces less TSH. And that's a bit of a problem because all the rest of the cells in the body use TSH to work out how many deiodinase, D2, D1 enzymes to make. So the number of enzymes that convert T4 to T3 don't stay constant. They're increased or decreased. And TSH affects that. High TSH means more deiodinase enzymes. It means more conversion. Lower TSH means the cells produce less deiodinase enzymes, which is less conversion. That's critical to be aware of in the whole system. It really is. Most doctors do not know that at all. And most endos don't know it, actually. So the thyroid manages to do it in a healthy person without suppressing TSH. In fact, in a healthy person with no thyroid issues, TSH can often be 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe more sometimes. And a TSH of 5 in a healthy person who's got no symptoms at all doesn't mean they're hypothyroid. It's very different when you're looking at thyroid hormones in a healthy person compared to when you try to diagnose someone who obviously has thyroid symptoms or is on thyroid treatment. Let me also talk about another value of the way the thyroid works. The thyroid gland is effectively a fail-safe mechanism. It's meant to be there. The way it works to be there is to extend life. When someone has a thyroid problem, say they've got Hashimoto's as an example, or if they get old, their thyroid tissue doesn't make as much T4 and T3. The thyroid gland is a very smart control system part, and it converts more T4 to T3. It can't make as much T4 and T3 combined, but as TSH rises, it converts an awful lot more T4 to T3. So the T3 level, the active, biologically active thyroid hormone, keeps fairly high in the presence of slightly higher TSH. So it maintains a reasonable level of active hormone without, and so the person doesn't really know they've got a thyroid issue, which is why often people go in and they start to have symptoms. They go into their doctor and the doctor does tests and they've got very high TSH, they've got high antibodies, they may have lost a ton of thyroid tissue, but to be honest, the symptoms have generally just recently appeared. The thyroid's managed to cover it up, to mask it for so long because it's done such a good job of shifting its production and its conversion to T3. And in some circles, some researcher circles, this is called a T3 shunt. The thyroid gland has an ability to shunt to T3 within it. Sometimes it's called a TSH T3 shunt. And it basically does a much better job of conversion when it has to do it. And it can do it without creating a situation where the TSH comes down, because as it produces less T4, the thyroid gland, it basically produces more T6. The overall effect is not to overly suppress TSH, which means the rest of the tissues, which also use TSH to make enough deodorinase enzymes, don't actually lose their ability to convert. They convert fairly well still, even if there's less T4 kicking around. So the thyroid gland is hugely important. And in a healthy person, it works as a great part of the control system. When you're on thyroid treatment, you start to take thyroid hormones, be it levothyroxine, synthroid, whatever it is. Basically, the way the thyroid works in the control system and its ability to basically generate more T3, that goes away. That control system just vanishes, basically. All bets are off. The whole system works differently. And the thyroid lab tests that appear in a healthy person are never quite the same. Let me explain that in a bit more detail. Basically, when you lose a thyroid gland, you lose that conversion. With thyroid, when you've got thyroid tissue damage, you lose that conversion ability. And when you're on thyroid treatment, you still lost it. So it's very, very common to find people that go on thyroid treatment and their FT3 levels, their T3 levels, are never quite the same as when they were healthy. Unfortunately, most of the time, these people haven't had thyroid lab tests done when they were healthy. But the research and the understanding of the system is, from that, it's very, very clear that it's very possible for FT3 levels to have shifted down to a much lower point when you're on thyroid treatment. Because basically, when you're on thyroid treatment, not only are you not getting the extra conversion from the thyroid gland that you used to have, either because you've got Hashimoto's or you've lost the thyroid, or because you're simply on thyroid treatment, which is suppressing TSH. So the TSH is lower than it was, which means the thyroid is not being asked to work as hard, right? So the thyroid treatment itself basically starts to push the thyroid gland out of the loop as being a useful thing to contribute. So as you take more and more thyroid treatment, more and more levothyroxine or synthroid or NDT or anything, the TSH will come down to a lower level, often 2, 1, or whatever, and the thyroid gland, regardless of whether it's you've got Hashimoto's or you've had a thyroidectomy, regardless of that, the thyroid gland is effectively beginning to be suppressed anyway. And so you're without that conversion ability, you're without that ability of it to manage the system well, and it changes. This is why I've written in the Thyroid Patients Manual about some of the new research. Some of the research is out there that should be being applied is really, really important, and it's all in the new book, the Thyroid Patients Manual. One of the examples is that we know now from research, if you take a population range of a lab range, say FT3 or FT4, it's this big. It's based on a large population, a large number of people. We know from research that an individual doesn't have a natural range like that. an individual has basically a range which is unique to them, and it's less than half as wide as that. It's, they think, about 38 to 40% typically for an individual. Not this big range here, but there for FT4 and FT3. So you have to, on thyroid treatment, you have to be in your own personal range. Okay? And this is what happens on thyroid treatment. Everything changes. It's a complete game changer. You're never in the same situation as you were in when you had a healthy thyroid, okay? So simply going along to your doctors and then looking at lab test results and saying, okay, that you're in the range, you're fine, the numbers are right, and you're thinking, how come I feel so awful? How come I'm not well? It's all different. It's not the same as when you had a healthy thyroid. Your numbers are all different. You've lost a whole ton of conversion, regardless of whether you've got Hashimoto's or not. Your thyroid medication is suppressing your thyroid. And chances are you've got lower FT3s than you had when you were healthy. And you need it to be at the right place for you, personally. So that's another thing that doctors don't understand. The thyroid as a control system and how the loss of the thyroid conversion affects everything. So we talked about conversion rate being affected. We talked about that aspect now about the thyroid gland as an important control part of the control system. Let me talk about another part that the doctors don't understand. And that's how cortisol often becomes low on thyroid treatment. And it happens so often that someone has never had a cortisol problem at all until they went on thyroid meds, and then it's crept up on them. And that's not really any surprise to me anymore. And it isn't adrenal fatigue, by the way. Don't believe in adrenal fatigue anymore. Let me explain. Doctors don't understand the importance of the T3 level to the pituitary gland. Why do I bother to mention the pituitary gland? Let me get that diagram back out. I did say I'd come back to it. Let me put it here and try and get the camera down to it. This could take a bit of manoeuvring here. Hang on a minute. Right, let's try this. Okay, here we go. Here we go. Oh, I should have had a pen here. I didn't use my finger. I meant to get a pen, but never mind. Here we have, this is from the Thyroid Patient's Manual book. And I talk about the whole system in the book a lot. This is a little bubble here. It's got hypothalamus and pituitary glands. And from them, a number of hormones come out, but from pituitary in particular, a number of hormones coming out. And ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, is one of them. And that's important because it makes the adrenal glands produce cortisol and DHEA. The adrenal glands are great little glands. They're very simple. And if they've got enough ACTH and enough cholesterol in the bloodstream, they just make lots and lots of cortisol and DHEA. They don't get fatigued. They're not tired. They're not stressed out. They just work. They work and they work and they work, and they make lots of cortisol over here that goes into the cells. And we know now that both cortisol and T3 are necessary within the cells. Cortisol helps T3 work, and T3 helps cortisol work. And they both work at the mitochondria, which make energy for us, cell energy called ATP. And they work at the cell nucleus, where everything really happens in terms of making of proteins and everything else that makes us well. And combination of cortisol and T3 working well keeps our metabolism up, makes us feel great, stops us being hypothyroid. Pituitary also makes TSH, we know that. I've already talked about the fact that once you're on thyroid hormone treatment, this gets affected, TSH gets affected. And the thyroid gland, whether or not you've got any tissue left, is basically shoved out of the loop, and you usually end up with a lot less conversion to T3 than you used to have. Everything changes. The one thing I wanted to mention here that I haven't really talked about that much so far is that the pituitary gland is like a little car, and its engine basically runs on fuel, and its fuel in this case is T3. When scientists have looked at all the tissues in the body, all the different types of cells, the different glands, different organs, they've found that the pituitary gland has the highest concentration T3 in the body without exception. Pituitary is capable of converting its own T4 to T3, and it uses a lot of that T3 itself in the gland. It's a busy little gland. It's very small. It's about the size of a pea, but it has a lot of work to do. So it needs T3. Now, I pretty much think I've proven this now, but I basically discovered about 17, 18 years ago that, well, I had extremely low cortisol, and let me put the back camera back onto me for a minute. I had extremely low cortisol levels, I mean, chronically low. I passed a synaptin test or an ACTH stimulation test, so I didn't have Addison's disease. My adrenal glands were fine, but in the absence of running the synaptin test, which gives you an artificial stimulation of ACTH, my normal levels of cortisol were terrible. At the bottom of all the ranges whenever I was tested, but no endocrinologist would be bothered to listen to that. Because I passed a synaptin test, I didn't have Addison's, they weren't interested. Turns out that once I've discovered what I'm going to talk about in a minute, I was able to correct that. Let's go straight to it. I'll go straight to it. I wasn't going to do it in this order, but I'm going to do it in this order. By the way, this diagram is on page 14 of the Thyroid Patient's Manual book. The next ones are on page 54. Let me get them out. Right, here we go. Let's go straight to this, because this is when it gets more clear. This is a chart, a typical average chart. It's from an endocrinology book showing cortisol level in blood through 24 hours. And the interesting point really is, this is 6 a.m. in the morning. This is when cortisol starts to rise in most people. It varies a lot, it varies a bit, you know, there's a bit of individual variation, but this shows this sort of pattern normally. This is 5, 6 a.m, cortisol levels come up, they peak around 8 or so. This is when most people want to get up and be active in the day, when the daylight's around, and you know, you're ready to start your day. You need good cortisol levels to not only wake you up, but to mean you can start the day with good energy. And then during the day, they come down a bit, and towards the end of the day, they're at the lowest when you're ready for. Okay, I put this on top of my laptop keypad and hit the stop button. So this is in 2 pieces now. That's a real shame, but there you are. These things happen. So I won't do that again. So here we go. So we got cortisol rising up at around 5, 6 a.m. It rises, it comes down again, and then the same pattern repeats. Around 3 a.m, 4 a.m, it starts to rise. So I found that in an endocrinology book many, many, many years ago. And then I found in a different endocrinology book this diagram. Try not to put it on the keypad this time. Okay, so this diagram shows over 24 hours patterns of TSH at the top, of FT4 here, and FT3 here. And there are a few interesting things on this. This is in page 54 of the Thyroid Patient's Manual book, by the way. And it's also in some of my blog posts, which I'll try and include when I post this video. Basically, what's really interesting is if you go straight down to the T3 chart, I'll keep this thing still for a moment. Go down to the T3 chart. T3 begins to rise up and get to a sort of peak level around 3 a.m. in the night. Okay, that's what's interesting. The variation here is quite small. This is 5.6 p moles per litre. This is 5.3. So we're only talking about less than 10% difference here between the top and the bottom of the range. But the interesting thing is at 3 AM, it's at just about the highest point of the day. That maps on to when cortisol starts to rise. And I've already said the pituitary gland runs on T3. It's when T3 peaks. We also see that T4 in a healthy person drops around then, which is a bit weird because TSH up here is rising to a peak. And basically, because TSH is rising in a healthy person, you would expect T4 to go up as well, because the thyroid gland would be making both T4 and T3. Well, T4 actually goes down, and that's because the thyroid gland itself is being driven harder by TSH and is not only producing more FT3 and FT4, it's also converting more FT4 to FT3. So that's why the T4 drops. It's actually being converted to T3 here. So you've got thyroid gland production of T3 and extra conversion of T3. And that maps neatly onto this chart, because this is when, this is around this time, after the T3 peaks, we see cortisol levels rising. And we see cortisol levels rising because this pituitary gland needs T3 to work. It runs on T3. Okay? And it won't, if it's deficient in T3, it won't be able to make ACTH. And if it can't make ACTH, this guy can't make enough cortisol. And we know cortisol needed over here to make T3 work. And we know the cells need T3 and cortisol at decent levels because the cortisol and T3 work synergistically to make our cells work. Okay, so back to me. I'll try not to just make this video into 3 bits, having messed it up already. So there we have it. We have the whole system, and it all works together beautifully in a healthy person. On thyroid treatment, all bets are off. You don't have the same FT3 level, even if you take NDT in the daytime. And the reason being, let's go back to this again, I'll hold it up this time. The reason being, when you take daytime medication, this chart, this FT3 chart, tends to be basically be skewed and much higher in the daytime and much lower at night. It doesn't work the same. Nothing works the same anymore. Daytime thyroid medication is not a physiological way to take it. It's not what the body is designed to do. It's designed to work like that. So, what can I say? Doctors, what do they think? They think TSH can be used to assess thyroid treatment. They think T4 always works. They think T4 always converges the same way. They think thyroid labs give them insight into how your hormones are working. And sometimes when you complain of lots and lots of symptoms still, and they're saying your labs are in range, they basically conclude, well, you're just depressed, or you've got ME, you've got chronic fatigue, you've got any other number of conditions, but it's not thyroid anymore. I've done my job. Bye-bye. And then you're packed off, feeling like death in some cases. And it's not, and they just don't understand how the system works. It's all about the system. You know, we're talking about conversion not being the same. We're talking about the thyroid gland as a key part of the control system being lost, or not just because it's been destroyed potentially, but on thyroid treatment it gets shoved out of the way anyway. Okay, we're talking about the impact of low T3 not just on you and your cells, but on the pituitary and the way cortisol works, and what way cortisol is produced. We're talking about a whole bunch of things that are no longer the same. Everything's different. So that's basically what this video is about. I think I've covered all of this and how to deal with it and how to recover from whatever type of thyroid issues you've got in my set of books, which are really a series about recovering from hypothyroidism. The Thyroid Patient's Manual book is effectively book number 1 in the series. The Thyroid Patient's Manual and it says on the front, from hypothyroidism to good health using T4, NDT, T3 or T4, T3 thyroid treatments. It's about all of them. It's about the whole system. It brings in all the new research, or at least a lot of it, and it points the way to a better way of treatment and recovery, which at the end of the day, it's all about getting well. Recovering with T3 is for those people that really need to use T3 to get well, and also if you've got a low cortisol issue that basically isn't getting sorted out on thyroid treatment. The CT3M Handbook is for those people that really need more information on using the circadian T3 method. They find they're not completely getting from recovering with T3. I think recovering with T3 is good in most cases. The CT3M Handbook is good as a backup if you need more information. So that's it pretty much. I'm sorry I chopped the video into two. I'll have to stop. I'll have to disable my little pad here on the laptop from now on. But these things happen. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this. I hope you read the books. Please do visit the website. It's recoveringwitht3.com. Good luck. I hope if you're still suffering with hypothyroidism that you find enough information to get well. If not, you can find me one way or another, either through the website or on my book Facebook page, that's facebook.com, Recovering with T3. Okay, that's all for me for the moment. Thank you. Bye.